Welcome everyone to this LiveNano talk. This time it's Utkur Mirsaidov who's going to tell us about his studies in studying bottom-up nanofabrication processes, as in synthesis, and top-down microfabrication processes that are used in clean rooms, for instance. And this is all in liquids in transmission electron microscopy. So the program for today is that I'll just spend a couple of minutes to update you on what we're doing here on our little LiveNano site. And then Utkur will give a talk for 45 minutes. And then there's time to do questions afterwards, which we will do via a platform called Slido. And I'll tell you about that shortly. And then you can stay on this Zoom link afterwards, where we will have an after talk discussion, which is fairly open-ended, where you can give feedback on the event and you can come with suggestions. And also we'll have a discussion on what else to create of events here, and also the upcoming analysis section where people are preparing an introduction to Python that's already online in the analysis page on LiveNano. But we'd like your feedback on what would you like in this, for instance. So stay on for that. And that's open-ended, so we'll just stay on for as long as it takes. And this end, as you can see in Zoom, is being recorded. So if you don't want your video to be in the screen, then don't show your face there. But we keep it as a meeting so that you can actually ask questions when we're at the question session afterwards. And afterwards, we'll make it available on the website, just like the previous ones are on our YouTube channel. And please provide your name and affiliation below your image if you want to have that in there. And then also please stay muted, because it's like an auditorium here. And then we use the Zoom chat if you've got Zoom issues, and then Slido for all the questions and comments you otherwise would have. And the community we're building up here around LiveNano is because a lot of researchers are entering this field of in situ studies, and it is fairly complex to achieve good in situ studies. So we are trying here to help people use and apply these methods best possibly, and also help each other to develop the best methods and make sure that we make the best progress out of this. And we do this providing you updates and learning materials with talks and workshops and short courses that are coming up now, but also hopefully with these little discussions after the events to have kind of an online community feeling where we can help each other out on little issues and give adverts to each other of new things coming up that we should be available be alert to. And all this is of course open source, so it's made by researchers and for researchers. And one thing that's coming up now is a short introductory course on Python-based image analysis. It's Daniel Kelly and Anders Boström that's doing this. Some of the things are already ready on the LiveNano in the analysis section. There's an introduction to working with image data in Python, and there's also how you get different file formats loaded in. So it's very basic introduction to Python right now. And then they're discussing how to make a good community about this. And what we're planning here is also to make what we call Python clinics, where we frequently take up some code that people submit and some problems they have, and we look at this together and try to make the best possible code together. And it's all going to go into the script library, which is already there, where you can find user-contributed functions for image processing, and you can also find some case studies and the images that have been analyzed so that you can validate your own code on this. And then there's also going to be a data bank where you can get good images to test your code on. But this we can talk about after the talk and question and answer session. And then there's also a next event coming up with a talk. That's Niels de Jong, and now we're changing from our more previous study that has been more material science. Now we're getting more biological in this one. He's going to discuss membrane proteins and how they study these with liquid phase electron microscopy. So that'll be in September. But I hope also there'll be many more events coming up in the autumn. We're planning them now. And then there's a related event. There's the MRS Fall Symposium on in situ and operando techniques. And there's also many other things going on in the MRS Falls that might be interesting for you, but you can go to the website and check it out. If you've got other things I should announce here, just let me know. And then for questions during the talks, we're using Slido. So you simply go to slido.com and you enter hashtag LiveNano, and then you can type in questions and you can vote up questions that you think are interesting. So when we get to the end of Utkur's talk, we will simply take the most voted for questions first, make sure that the most interesting ones are covered. That works pretty well. But now we're getting to the interesting part. Utkur, So it's real pleasure to have you here today to tell us about visualizing the bottom-up and top-down formation of nanomaterials and liquids with transmission electron microscopy. And I mean, you're associate professor of the Department of Physics, and you're co-director of the Center for Bioimaging Science at the National University of Singapore. And you've had quite a good career in terms of both doing semi-biological things. You've done a beautiful study of proteins, I remember, first and foremost, and then I really like your study of these top-down fabrication processes and what's going on in silicon. I'm doing microfabrication myself, and I found it really intriguing to get these liquid phase TM images of what's going on there. But I was also thinking to ask you, so that we could get a little more to know you, all the nice results you've had, what are you most proud of?
Come again? Hello?
I can hear you.
Oh, yeah. What did you say?
What are you most proud of in your work so far?
Oh, well, it's very hard to say. Actually, I think the most proud would be switching to this field. So briefly, my history evolves, as a PhD student, I worked a lot of time on a magnetism. And then I did a lot of work on biosensors and tissue engineering and biology. But then I stumbled on this field when I came to Singapore, actually. So before I came here, I did not even know anything about the microscopy. I've barely used the TEM. So when I came, there was also no TEM, no clean room. So what would be the proudest thing is just like being able to, set up this facility. Now we have pretty much everything. So we fabricate our own devices. We have more than enough microscopes. So yes, building this facility up, and of course, it wasn't just me. It's like a lot of people, especially my mentor Paul Matsudaira, was mainly involved in this. But that's I would list this as the most proudest thing, setting up this facility.
And what do you do now? You set up the facility. You're able to build your own stuff and produce beautiful results in the C2 liquid phase. What do you see as the biggest challenge in your field right now?
I think the biggest challenge is we all agree, right? It's separating the beam induced phenomenon from the actual phenomenon. So beam was our friend for a while, right? So early papers were all driven by the beam. We did not understand what was going on, but we report, okay, we crank up this thing, things happen. Okay, we try to understand. So now we got to the point where we're slowly starting to understand. But I think the biggest challenge would be actually eliminating or operating under the conditions where the beam has no impact. And for that, I don't think it's just that experimentation, but also computation will have to come in and drastically improve what we can do.
Yeah. So now you're going to present us all your beautiful results, but I was also thinking, what are you focusing on these days? What is, if you look into your lab now, what's the main focus of your efforts these days?
So the key projects, key projects that we are working on are mostly industry related, and we have a lot of other side hobby projects that we somehow managed to fund. But most of the projects are around nano fabrication, microfabrication, how to build a better and better performing transistor. Specifically, right now, beyond silicon, we are more working on the metallization process, how to build the interconnects. So interconnect, I'll tell you, I think I just have 1 or 2 slides at the end. Interconnect is just these wires that connect the transistors. And that we started to venture into this area very recently, like a few months ago. So this is the big part of our work nowadays.
Great. But hey, I'm looking very much forward to see your presentation. I'll stop sharing and leave the screen for you.
Okay, so let me share then the screen. Live, no, where is this? Okay, screen 1. Okay, so everyone can see the slides?
Yep, I think.
Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, thanks for inviting me, Christian. I mean, I know that was your baby for a long time, that you wanted to build this thing up, and now eventually it's like real and happening online. So thanks for having me here as a speaker. So today I would be giving a brief overview, not without going too much into details of what we do, what we did, and what we do in my group. So as you're all familiar, we use an electron microscope to image nanoscale dynamic processes. And it may be in a gas and liquid, right? So we use this platform called the liquid cell, which most of you probably know is just a sandwich. It's the liquid between two electron transparent membranes, thus protects it against the vacuum column in the column of the TEM. So for most part, we do use commercial holders and commercial chips, but for most part, we design our own custom holders and custom chips for a very specific applications. So here is an image of our holder, and we have to design these holders because we work with very non-standard samples. Like some of our wafers are not 200 micron thick, but 775. That's what the industry uses, right? So this is the typical wafer. So you have to develop a holder that can accommodate for that. And we work with very, very nasty chemicals. So if you have just a titanium retainer or titanium tip that the commercial holders have, it might actually damage your 80,000 to 150,000 holder like in a couple sessions. So that's why we have to build our holders that are also resistive to these chemicals. And most of our advanced chips, we do it here in our clean rooms, as you see here. Let me start by telling you one of the stories that kind of fascinates me. So it's a nucleation of the crystal. So I'm going to go. So this is also going to touch on the point of the beam effect, right? So I'm going to go and describe how materials nucleate or form from a solution, right? So since we are little children, we try to put things together to form a bigger and more complex structures, and it's not unique to us, and we didn't figure out throughout the evolution, but that's how actually nature also works, right? So it has some fundamental building blocks, and from that it assembles materials, right? So if you talk about phase, you take atoms or molecules, you put them together, and then you have your crystal. Or if you're talking about more complex hierarchical structure, it's a self-assembly, right? So you take small, similarly shaped particles and put them together. But it's nevertheless, you start with the fundamental building blocks and assemble them together into what you want, right? So in the case of the crystals, you start with ions, atoms, or molecules, and it forms crystals. So this is how the process happens. Or this is the beginning state and the end state. We know that we start with building blocks and we end up with a final material. But how process happens, it's very complicated and very poorly understood, right? So this is an excerpt from Jim's paper, and he gave a talk last time. And material can take multiple pathways to reach its final state, which is a crystal, right? So I'll tell you, but that's not how we used to think about these things. Like even couple decades ago, that was not the way we would think about how materials form. And that's a point of the first part of my talk. So how do materials form and how do materials nucleate from a solution? So here what you see is a nucleation of gold nanocrystals imaged with a TEM from a solution. So you have a gold precursor solution, it just has a gold ions. And while you're imaging, you see how the gold phase is emerging. So this is one of our earlier works. And if you break down the movie into pieces, what you see is solution. You start with a homogeneous solution of precursor solution. Solution phase separates into gold dense and gold poor regions. So these dark regions are gold dense or solute rich regions, and the brighter regions are the solute poor regions. And you see this once it's phase separate, it still has a fluidic behavior. It is it's not really rigid, right? And this continues to collapse, and it collapses into something that's more or less looks like a nanoparticle, but it is not a crystal, right? So you can take a Fourier transform of many of these particles, and I think we've looked at 15,000 of them, and it is not crystal; they're all amorphous. And at a certain phase, at a certain time point, this thing crystallizes. So you start with a solution phase separates, and this dense into dense and poor, gold dense and gold poor regions, and gold dense region just collapses into particle, which then crystallizes. Schematically illustrated here. Okay, so but that's not how one would describe a nucleation process, at least a few decades ago, right? So we would use the classical nucleation theory, which states, atoms or individual blocks spontaneously come together to form a nuclei of a critical size that can sustain the growth. And if you form this critical size, then your crystal grows, right? So, but everything happens is just in a single step. But what we see here, it's not actually a single step, but it's a multi-step process, right? So because we couldn't see it before, we were missing this other steps that lead to the crystal or nuclei formation. So here, by just being able to directly monitor them, you can really identify the missing steps from the previous theories. Okay, so we've looked at it at different doses, right? So now the key point, all this process is beam driven, right? So we looked at the process at different doses. At a low dose, at a lower doses, nucleation takes longer time. As you increase the dose, the crystals form really, really fast. So, what is electron doing? Of course, we say, okay, electron, it's the solvated electrons acting as a reducing agent, and then your gold 3+ is getting reduced to a gold, your gold ions are getting reduced to gold atoms, and these atoms forming the crystal. Okay, nice. So we actually using the beam as a friend here, right? It's not always a friend, but in this particular case, it happens to be working with us. And just to show that this is purely beam-driven phenomena, this is a distribution of the nucleation times as a function of the electron flux for these samples, right? So more beam, faster nucleation or faster crystallization. Okay, while we can somehow justify saying, okay, beam does this and that, but this is not entirely a system that is free of the beam artifact. When you synthesize a crystal on a benchtop, you do not bring a microscope next to it and then shine a beam to make it, right? So you can use all the justification in the world, but at some point we have to kind of try to do these experiments that are relevant to common synthesis or growth or nucleation phenomena. Okay, so what is the most sensitive or one of the most sensitive materials to the beam? It happens to be metal organic frameworks. I mean, even if you try to image a metal organic frameworks, it's not so simple. Here is the image of the metal organic MOF, or this particular one is the ZIF-8, and it was published in 2017. So that was imaged under extremely low dose conditions, right? So just being able to image the static structures of MOF was a very, very big deal very recently, right? So because these materials are beam sensitive. Now we're talking about 1 electrons, 4 electrons. Earlier I was showing you the movies that are like 100 seconds long, and we were putting like thousands of electrons to drive the processes. Well, can't do it here. Your material just gonna evaporate or disappear, right? So this is the structure of the ZIF. So to really understand the nucleation of the ZIF, because we can't image it at a very high resolution, so we cannot identify whether it's a crystal or not, right? Because if you try to image with a very high resolution, you have to pump in a lot of electrons. And then you have to image the entire process. It takes time, and you're gonna affect or you're gonna destroy your specimen, right? So to really identify how this nucleation happens, what we did, we synthesized cubic MOFs. So these MOF crystals, you just add a trace amount of CTAP, and then all of a sudden, these MOF crystals, the MOF crystal you're synthesizing become the cubic MOFs. And these MOFs, highly crystalline. They're single crystal. You can see it from this Fourier transform pattern. And we're gonna use the shape as a signature of crystallinity, because we're not going to be able to see, when we're doing in situ, we're not going to be able to see the lattice resolution. So our goal is to use the shape. If you have a cubic shape, then it's a crystal. Can we actually say so without looking at without having a high resolution image? Well, the answer turns out to be yes. So this is a cryo-TM image of MOF, and we looked at, I don't know, like 98 cubes. Every one but one was crystalline. So every cube synthesized MOF, everything that had a cubic shape was a crystal. I mean, from the diffraction image. So shape is a very, the cubic shape is a very strong indication of the crystallinity of the MOF. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna use this. And we also looked at the effect of the beam very quickly. Okay, so we pre-synthesize them off, we put them into the liquid cell under the liquid condition, and we start imaging. And what you see, 120 seconds, they're disappearing. So this tells us, okay, what is our working window? How much dose we can put in, or how much dose we, how long we can do those experiments. And this experiment, so I'll show you in a bit what the dose is, but you see they disappear quickly, right? So typically we will need like 50, 60 seconds to see the phenomena, but that's, at 100 seconds they're already disappearing. So I would assume at 50 or 75 seconds the damage starts kicking in. So disappearing is already, so everything is falling apart, right? So if you're a car, your wheels are coming out, the doors are falling apart. But damage probably happens much, much earlier, right? So we have to be very, very careful about the doses we use. So how do we do the experiments? Well, we do the experiments just like this. So what you see here, nothing, right? That's your typical experiment. When you're doing the experiment, when you're imaging them off. So right now I'm showing you all this once we work out. But this was like 2 years before we work out the conditions. But now I say, okay, this is a perfect dose to see them off, and you see nothing, right? So we have a precursor solution. Our electron flux is 0.005 electrons per angstrom square per second. So this is much, and the cumulative dose is 3. This is much lower the dose than the cryo EM people in biology. So this is, they use like 10, 15, 5 in some cases. But this is well below that, right? So, and you're trying to do in situ. You see nothing. Well, so that's why we do a bit of image processing, and then see what, let's see if we can see things. This is like average. So what you see in here is the image of the nucleation process. We average them, do the drift correction iteratively, and then we apply on subframes. So we average 10 frames, and then we drift correct them. Then we apply this drift corrector to individual frames within that average moves, and we keep doing it iteratively until we get this nice build-up image. And you see the formation of the nanocubes or MOF crystals. Again, what you see here, things phase separating, forming some amorphous-like aggregates, and then they're becoming kind of cubes, right? So what we saw actually with the beam-driven phenomena for the gold nanoparticles, right? Gold, you can bombard it with electrons, it doesn't damage. Here you have a lot of organics, so these are beam sensitive. But you see the same process. So you can see actually you can visualize the nucleation of the MOFs at extremely low doses. Well, yeah, so you say this is low dose. How do I know this is a low dose, right? So you have to do more checks, right? Because that's a key challenge of this in situ TM, right? How do we know that what we're seeing is still not affected by the beam? So what we do is we take our in situ TM images where we see homogeneous solution, phase separation, formation of amorphous particles, which then collapse into the MOF crystals. And we compare it with quench and look approach of the cryo-TM. So we take a reaction solution and we quench it at different times, and we observe the process, and we see, okay, so more or less we find a similar trends, and of course we had to do many of those before to convince ourselves. So this is all, it's in a supplementary information, but it's not just one shot and you handpick the one that you like. So you have to really convince yourself what you're seeing is actually it's relevant. And so I told you that, okay, so the last stage is crystallization. This stage and this stage is not crystallization. But how can I tell from here? How do I know that this is not crystal? How do I know this is not nothing here is crystal? How do I know there is like not small pieces of crystal assembling together? Well, what you can do, we do cryo-ED. So we take electron diffraction. So, okay, homogeneous solution, amorphous. Phase separated, gold-rich, gold-dense solution, amorphous. This amorphous nanoparticles, amorphous. I mean, I already preemptively called it amorphous nanoparticles, but you see it's amorphous. And only when it collapses into a cube in the cryo-ED shows that we have a crystalline phase, right? Okay, so then you can ask a question. Why can't you just, oh, okay, so if the cryo can tell you, why do you need an in situ? I mean, well, you can, well, the point is, I would not know to look for this structure in the first place if I didn't have at least this one a guide. But cryo also misses a lot of things. So here is the nucleation event, right? So you have a solution which is phase separating, slowly condensing and collapsing into the nanocubes, right? Again, here you have this collapsing into this crystal nanocubes. But is this the thing that always happens? And answer is no, right? Sometimes you form the dense regions, they attempt to collapse, but then they dissolve into the solution. So cryo would not tell you, right? So because you're not tracking individual particles or individual occurrences of dense regions. Here you can really identify, and this is important because this is attempt rate to form a crystal, and the number of the failed rates actually determines your nucleation rate, right? So this is why, so if you understand how crystals form, then you can predict the nucleation rates. Most of the models based on the classical nucleation, there is a gross discrepancy between the nucleation rates they predict and the experimental observed one. So by understanding this, how this process actually flows, it can help or enable you, to understand the whole entire nucleation much better. So just to summarize this part of the talk, and this is not just to MOF, and as I showed you, this also applies to metals, right? So you start from a solute-rich phase, you condense into this dense liquid or or solute dense phase, and then this phase can go back and forth, and then you form amorphous phase, right? So here is what we saw. Whenever you form this dense phase, and if dense phase collapse from our in situ moves, when dense phase collapses into amorphous phase, we never saw it going back. But at this point, this is the decision-making step. Here you can still disappear. But once you form this amorphous aggregate, most likely you end up going to the next stage, which is crystallization or formation of the MOF crystal. Okay, how much time I have? Okay, so maybe at this point it would be a good time spot for me to change gears. So I'm going to just briefly describe another work that's going on in our lab, and this is actually using this in situ TEM as a platform, as a metrology platform for semiconductors, right? In semiconductor industry, they heavily rely on TEMs because the most of the structures they work with is like sub 3, 4, 5 nanometers nowadays, right? So nowadays, I think the state-of-the-art transistors are 7 nanometers. So you really have to use that. You really have to use a TEM to characterize your devices. But here, our goal is actually try to maybe see if semiconductor industry can benefit from this in situ approach. And we work with a number of companies. So one of them is TEL, Tokyo Electron. We worked with Micron. In the past, we worked with Lam Research. It's a big tool manufacturer. We also work with AMAT and so on. Okay, so this is your typical computer chip. So what you have inside your typical computer chip is a lot of wires here. These are like stacks of wires that are connecting billions and billions of nanoscale transistors. So these are the transistors, right? So this is your classical FinFET, and these are the interconnects. So what I'm gonna show you is mostly, first part is going to be mostly focused on the transistors, right? So these are very small transistors. Let's see. So these are very small transistors, and you will see that we use our approach to figure out how to build or how to process silicon in a very controlled manner. Okay, so why is it important? So now recently it has been all over the headlines, right? You have this China-US war going on, who's going to be who's going to dominate the chip world, and also another important thing is the shortages of chips. You can't make cars apparently, so people just realize that chips are important for refrigerators, for ACs, for everything apparently, right? And there have been a big shortage of chips. And then if you look at this stocks of the semiconductor companies, like they quadrupled over the last 6 months, and it is important, right? But being important is one thing, but their ability to manufacture better performing chips is also limited by certain laws of physics, right? So you see, as we move every time if you move to next generation of the chips here, what's happening? It's shrinking the dimension of the chips, meaning we're packing more transistors, we're making better or more powerful chips, right? So chips have more transistors, so you're making more transistors per chip. And what's happening is, as the dimension goes down, design of each type of chip is increasing significantly. So you can reduce the size by a little bit, but this can just easily double your cost per design of the chip, right? For one iPhone you have this, for Samsung. So each different phone manufacturer or microelectronic or electronics manufacturer have different requirements. So this, even though it looks like, oh yeah, it's 150 million, it's not a scary number, but it depends, right? So you have so many different electronics out there, and this cost can add up, and this is like in tens of billions of dollars, right? So we have to figure out how to pack more and more chips. Well, I mean, eventually you will be limited by physics, right? So you can't make a transistor smaller than an atom, right? So you have 20, maybe you can get 10, or maybe you pump in more money, a lot of innovation, you can go to like 5, 3 nanometers. At some point, you're gonna reach the physical limit. So what's the roadmap? How is semiconductor industry is gonna try to overcome this challenge? Well, so this is the current technology. So this is a little bit outdated. This is supposed to be 2022, but we are still stuck somewhere here. They always update their roadmaps, but they just update the dates because in the news, it's like always a delay. Intel next node technology is delayed, or they demonstrate something, but there is no news, for years. Used to be every 2 years you would get doubling in the chip density, right? So that was a beautiful days when we would conform to Moore's law. Now it's not so trivial. It's getting more and more complicated. So the idea is, as we go more into the future, is actually to switch from current FinFET transistors. So why they're called FinFET? Because they look like a shark fins here, and then you have a gate around it, right? So that's why this is called fin field effect transistors. We're gonna switch more and more to stack designs, or it can be sheets, it can be wires, and eventually we have to go towards the more and more vertical wires, which is at the end here. And we have to stack them in 3 dimensions. Then there is no limit, right? So if you can figure out how to put them together vertically, then you're not really limited by by your XY dimension. So you can keep packing more and more as you go. And that's the idea. That would be the ideal design, right? So this is so go from this FinFET all the way to stacked or even parallel nanowires or combination of those. And this is all cartoons. This is Adobe Illustrator version of what's supposed to happen. Doesn't mean it's gonna happen, but that's how they envision it, right? So there's always constantly modifying this designs as as it gets challenging, or if there is a better architecture that come up. But the idea is we have to go towards a three-dimensional, towards more 3D stacked version of the transistors. Of course, there are going to be a lot of problems, right? When you put so many transistors. So right now, I'm not talking about all these other problems, because you put so many transistors together in a small box. I mean, the heat generated is going to be humongous, right? So it's then you're going to run into other issues. But this is going to be addressed by a software, where software can efficiently utilize different parts of the chip during its operation. But this is beyond the point of my presentation. So how do we fabricate or manufacture nanostructures today? You start with the silicon, right? So I mean, your typical SOI wafer, silicon on insulator, and you just bombard, or you kind of with reactive ions. So you kind of bombard with this energetic ions that react and then eat away the material, and you end up with desired structures, and then you go do your metallization process, or you put or deposit whatever you want. And most of the time, this reactive ionage is called a dry reactive ionage. So it's done inside this plasma chamber. And what you have here is you have to put your wafer in there, and then you have to have you have to be able to generate a very uniform plasma and so on. But the problem is this: you can only process one wafer at a time. This is one thing. And when you're bombarding it with the ions, you damage the surfaces. If your transistor is 7 nanometers or 5 nanometers, it's all surface. If you even damage 1 or 2 layers, you're damaging the entire device, right? So that's why this is one of the disadvantages of this dry process. And when it comes to certain semiconductors, sometimes it has a very poor selectivity or slow etch rate. Even though slow etch is not such a big issue, but the poor selectivity can be an issue when you start removing the material that you want to keep there. So if you want to remove certain material but not touch the other material, it might become an issue, because when you do dry etching, sometimes the selectivity is poor. So alternative to it would be a wet etch, and wet etch is something that has been done for a long time conventionally, and you can process stacks and stacks of the wafer at one go, and wet etch can be, depending on your chemistry, it can be highly selective. And since it's a chemical reaction on the surface and not a bombardment, it actually does not damage the surface that much. So the wet etch has a clear advantage. So one of our kind of mission questions was really to explore how wet etch works at the nanoscale. So it was a part of the project. So what you see here is etching of a silicon. So what you have here, so we mimic a typical transistor. This is a feature transistor that are vertical, and put it into our liquid cell. So we fabricate on a wafer and build a liquid cell out of it. So this is your silicon pieces here. This is a silicon pieces, and this is a side view, and this is a top view. And what we do, we introduce the alkaline etchant and observe how the silicon etches. So here is the image, or here is a movie of the etching process. And what you see here during the etching is you start with this nanowires, and as it slowly etches, the reaction product starts appearing, right? So what is happening here? Reaction products appear, nucleate on the surface, detach, and dissolve in the solution. But if you look at the classical textbook description, open any microfabrication textbook, and what you see is, it's a reactant coming, reacting with the surface, and then byproduct is detaching and moving into the solution. But that's not the case. So all the byproducts sit on the surface, and then they nucleate, and only when they reach a certain critical size, they detach and then start dissolving in the solution. And I'm not going to go what are the forces that are holding them together, but it has to do with the surface termination of the silicon during the etching in OH. So, but these details you can find here. But once we understood this, so we did this experiments. Of course, these byproducts are not good. Why? Because these byproducts limit the access of the etching. So it introduces a surface roughness, and you don't want this. Because if you want to build a very small transistors, you want to really have a very full control over the surface. And if you have this, you just limit the access of etching, and you can start forming bumps on the surface. So then, because we understand now what's happening, can we prevent the nucleation of these byproducts on the surface? And it turns out yes, because we understand what is the surface chemistry of this, what is the modification to surface chemistry during the etching. And it turns out adding small trace amount of alcohol or pretty much any organic that can passivate the surface actually prevents the nucleation of the byproducts. And what you see here is essentially smooth etching with very small or almost no amount of byproducts forming on the surface. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but this is just because we can watch, understand what's going on, and then we can actually improve the process. So here what I show you, this is amorphous silicon. The same thing can be done for the crystalline, right? So the reason we did this amorphous here earlier is because there is no way you can grow a crystal on top of a nitride. So we really had to kind of change our design of our holder. So we had to do this on a SOI wafer. Now instead of nitride membrane, we have a oxide membrane, and oxide is very fragile. So you have a oxide, membrane here, and then you have a silicon nanostructures here. And this is a crystalline silicon. You can see, look at the diffraction pattern. It's beautiful, right? So it's a single crystalline diffraction pattern. And then we look at the etching, right, of this thing, how etch happens. And bear in mind, it's a silicon oxide membrane this time. And when you do KOH etching, unfortunately, KOH reacts with the oxide, and it etches at much higher rate than a nitride. So you have to be very careful. And we've occasionally broke the membrane inside our TEM, and then I think our lenses are contaminated with this KOH and all these unwanted chemicals. So I wouldn't go and touch our lenses at this point. Okay, so this is the movie, and then you see this flickering. It's flickering is just because membrane is not very stable, so it's like its own axis, like silicon tilting. But you see how this etch is happening, right? So you see etching. Now since it's a crystalline, you clearly see the anisotropic etching. Certain fast etch directions etch faster, and the slow etch directions no etch planes don't etch, and you end up with this kind of a diamond shape pattern, right? Well, so okay, so this is so this is not super surprising. Okay, this is what you expect. How a silicon should etch. But as a serendipity, my former postdoc described, actually you can control etch directions. If you do a KOH or TMH etch, your etch directions are dictated, right? So you have a fast etch planes, and then you have a slow etch planes. But apparently, what we saw is you can actually control the etch direction. So here I showed the example where we can rotate between the fast etch direction. I mean, we're still in the process of filing patent, that's why I cannot describe the mechanisms. But but what I'm trying to show here is just understanding this helps you to really control the etch process. And etching of silicon in KOH has been around for a long time, right? But still, there are some discoveries to be made. Okay. Here we are all looking at the nano wires, and we only see a very limited number of the etch directions. Can we really use this, build it into a platform where we can not only look at the 110 and 100 direction, but we can gradually probe between different etch planes? Well, how can you do it? You build this thing called a wagon wheel, right? So this wagon wheel has very different so each face of this wagon wheel has a different crystal plane, and as you go around it, you can see that you have access to all the different crystal planes. And this is and you can do it across a large wafer, and you pattern this on a silicon membrane, a silicon oxide membrane, and then you can watch. This is a movie of this etch happening. Again, you see very selective etching, right? So it's etching along very certain directions and not along the other directions. So you can really control, and then you see this small things falling apart, and you can do a lot of quantification. I'm not going to go into the details, but at least you can really not only visualize, but they can also quantify what's going on at the nanoscale. And you see not all of them at the nanoscale etch very uniformly. In bulk, over the time, when you do the etching in the bulk, you say, okay, my etch is 3 hours, sometimes it's 3.5 hours, and so on. But at the nanoscale, because you're etching very small amount, you can be very sensitive to these discrepancies in the times, and then certain directions might etch a little bit at a different rate. Okay, so if you're going to work with the solutions, if your process of fabricating this nanostructure is going to be based on the solution or on the solution-based processes, another challenge is capillary forces. When you have very small structures that are like 10, 20 nanometers, and it's all submerged in a solution, you try to pull it off, what's going to happen? They're going to collapse because of the capillary forces, right? And can we image these processes? And of course, so this is what you're imaging here. What we're seeing here is a drying process, how nanowires collapse during the drying, right? So what you see is as liquid recedes, these nanowires, the water, small amount of water gets trapped between the pillars. So you kind of form a pseudo droplets, and these pseudo droplets have a capillary force that cluster them together and holding them together. And once all the liquid is evaporated, your structures are stuck. So this is a typical capillary damage. So water leaves, you have this trace amount of droplets or nano droplets that band them together, and then once this leaves, because of the adhesion between these nanostructures, you're damaged. You're permanently damaged. So you're done. So game over, right? So like almost everything is damaged, right? If you want to build the transistors, yeah, over this, I don't know, like 1,000, there is maybe one survived. Not good, right? When the industry say even like 99.9 is not good for them, right? So their tolerances are much higher, right? So if you do experiment, you have a 10% or you have a 50-60% success rate, it's a good. But for industry, you build 1 billion transistors, they want like almost all of them functional. So then the question is, can we take these structures that go and collapse? Can we reverse the damage? Can we take? Once we process and if they're collapsed, can we reverse the damage? And the answer is yes. But can we? And the answer is going to be yes. But how is it done? And can we visualize this whole process? Well, one thing to note: when two silicon surfaces come together, they always have a native surface. Which native surface is usually the native oxide layer. So this native oxide surface, when it comes together, is the thing that sticks, right? So it's adhesion between the oxide. So how can then the question is, okay, if I want to release them, so it's about disrupting the adhesion between the oxide surfaces. How can one break the bond between oxide? So what removes the oxide? It's HF, right? So any of you who've done microfabrication, you know that if you want to remove native or any oxide, you put it in the HF or buffered oxide etch. And we've tried this, and actually it works. So you see here when you have a damaged structures, you etch them in the oxide, and they all restore, like almost all of them. Okay, can we visualize? Well, so again, keep in mind, HF is not a friendly asset. If you spill it on yourself, you're not going to feel it until your bones start melting away, right? So you have to be, again, very careful. And doing this inside electron microscope, especially, right? Because if you don't want to contaminate your lenses, because at some point engineers will have to take it. So you have to really let them know what's going on there, what kind of experiments you do. And here what you have is actually the nanopillars in the presence of the HF inside the microscope, right? So that's why, that's why I'm telling you, we have to design the holders ourselves. We always work with this unfriendly chemical. And what you see here is nanopillars that are stuck originally when you introduce the HF. So maybe let me play from the beginning. Okay, so when we introduce the HF, these pillars start restoring. So you said there's like bright, so that means when there was no liquid, and HF come in, that's why you have this darkish background, and then you see the nanopillars are restored. And if you look carefully how they're restoring, you can really visualize there's like two dominant modes of collapse, where they collapse either 2 by 2 or 2 by 2 or 1 by 2. And the way they restore here is just like snap back, or in this case, when the 4 of them form a cluster, they break into small pieces, and then they restore individually, just like this. Right, again, so you can visualize these processes. Okay, so this part was focused on this nanowires, on the silicon part. Now going forward, what are we doing, right? So what are we working on? So we're working now. Our focus shifted slightly towards the metallization process or building better interconnects. So what's the problem with the interconnects, or what is the interest? Layers and layers and layers of stacked wires that provide the power to your transistors, that connect all your transistors together, right? So if you have billion transistors, you have to have a matching number of wires to supply them with the power and to connect them, right? So because these transistors have to be in constant communication with each other, and it is not trivial task, right? Because this, like a typical chip, you open your latest Intel processor, the length of all these interconnect wires exceeds 10 kilometers. So inside the chip, you have more than 10 kilometers of the wires that are connecting this transistor. And as I said, as in the future, we're going to go to a larger and larger number of transistors. That means your wires have to get denser and denser. How do you make things denser? You make them smaller, right? So, and that becomes a problem for the copper interconnect, right? So this is copper interconnect. So I'm not going to go into these details what you have this, but you have to have this diffusion barrier which prevents the copper diffusing into silicon or silicon oxide and damaging the your whole transistor setup down there. Okay, what is the problem with the copper? Why can't you just make the copper, keep making copper smaller? Well, as you make the copper smaller, as you shrink this, the resistivity of copper shoots up. And it's not just going to shoot up because your cross-sectional area is reducing, right? It's not just this classical Ohm's law where your resistance is inversely proportional to the area squared, but it shoots up because of these copper grains. So that is normal increase that we expect, right? The scaling with the area. But then there is a huge logarithmic or exponential increase associated with these grains. And at some point, copper starts underperforming metals like tungsten and molybdenum. Those high resistivity metals that you usually think about this in the bulk to be high resistivity, they start outperforming copper at this nanoscale, right? So there is a limit how much you can shrink. And beyond that point, you cannot shrink. So then you have to switch. I mean, you can scale it down to a certain size, but at certain point, you have to switch to better performance metals. It can be tungsten, it can be molybdenum, it can be even ruthenium, and so on. Those metals all outperform your copper. So this is the thing with the copper. Like if you have like already 10 nanometers, you already see the issues happening here in this resistivity plot. Well, so what do we do? So we look at different metals: moly, tungsten, ruthenium. So this is a typical our test structures. These are metal lines fabricated on a silicon nitride membrane, right? So we have all these different scale ones going all the way to like 25 nanometers or so. This is molybdenum lines embedded into your membrane, and we want to understand what happens when we heat them. Can we grow the grain size? So one of the things would be, okay, so if you have this granular metal, let's say at confinement, what's going to happen to can you control the crystallinity by, I don't know, annealing it? Annealing under certain reducing atmosphere, because reducing atmosphere removes the oxide between the grain boundaries and so on. So this is something you want to do going into the future. And also, how do we etch them? How do we process them? The surfaces of these things have to be extremely uniform. So if there is a roughness on the surface, you're gonna increase the resistivity due to the surface scattering. So you have to be very careful when you etch and when you anneal them, right? Okay, so our goal is now, what we have here is we actually can integrate into our liquid cell. So this is just a very recent result that my postdoc Ifan took. So what you see here, you see like etching of the metal line. We've all seen etching of metal nanoparticles, right? Here and there, like different versions, different facets etched differently and so on. But now, in this case, we're actually patterning things that are crystalline. So this is like crystallinity is not controlled. So what we're gonna do in the future, we're gonna actually anneal, see how crystallinity changes, and then see how, depending on the annealed conditions, how this etching gonna change and so on. But again, this is your typical nanoparticles, but patterned, right? So it's and these are like microns and centimeters long nanowires. Okay, so with this, I would like to end my talk. So I hope I gave you a taste of what's going on in our lab, and I'd like to thank my people who are the actual guys who do the work I just present, and the collaborators who are very, very helpful, both in terms of advice and samples and so on, and of course funding agencies.